Here we are for an hour of discussion with young students, young researchers, like you today, Valentin Hartmann. Hi.
Hi, great to be here.
Thank you for being here. So please, could you introduce yourself and tell us what you are doing right now at EPFL?
Yeah, I've been at EPFL for several years now. I recently finished my PhD there, where I've worked on privacy and confidentiality in AI and data science. Towards the end of my PhD, I've also worked on a quite different topic, namely how to aid language learners with AI. And this is what I'm continuing to work on now after my PhD. So together with a friend of mine, I decided to create a startup to try to bring our research to people to help them learn languages. Mm-hmm. And right now we are supported by a grant from the Swiss government and are still affiliated with EPFL, where we are continuing our research to eventually make our tools available to people.
Mm-hmm. So what is this tool about exactly?
A common problem that my co-founder and I noticed with people who try to learn languages is that at the beginning they are really motivated. So I have tons of friends who came to Switzerland for their PhD. They didn't know any French before. The first thing they did here was to take a language course from the EPFL Language Center. They made some progress throughout their first semester, and then they didn't follow up on that. So they didn't take a second course, they didn't continue learning vocabulary, and they didn't really get to a level where they could have comfortable conversations with locals. And I think this is a very common topic, a problem. So people simply either lack the time to regularly sit down and study as much as one has to make progress, or they lack the motivation. Mm-hmm. And we want to solve this problem by not forcing people to sit down and do exercises, but to instead integrate the learning into their daily lives.
So how can AI help with this?
Yeah, the AI can help in many different ways here.
But in your tool precisely.
Yeah, so we are building a first product, which is based on this idea of integrating the learning into everyday lives. Imagine you are a French native speaker and you want to learn English, and you're reading Harry Potter or some other book. And so naturally you would read it in French. And what we are doing is we are replacing some of the words in this French text with English words. So, for example, there might be a sentence about Hogwarts, and in that sentence we might replace the word école with school. At the beginning, we only do this with very few words that are very easy to guess from the context of the surrounding text. But as you progress through the Harry Potter books, we slowly replace more and more words with English words. And by the time you reach the 7th book, the whole text is in English and you speak English. That's kind of the vision. In practice, this will be a bit slower. Yeah, but this is kind of one of the things that we are building. And now there are a couple of hard problems that need to be solved in order to make this a reality. So one kind of obvious problem is that we need to know which English words to replace the French words with. So we need to do some kind of machine translation. And we cannot simply take a dictionary and just look up the French words there, because based on the context, a word might mean different things. That's one problem. The other thing is that, especially in French, there are many different versions of words, so conjugations and declensions. And so we need something smarter there. And for this, we have built our own machine learning models that can translate words in context to always show you the correct words.
And does it work every time, or do you have some challenges to go over?
Like with essentially any AI tool, this doesn't work perfectly. This is not kind of based on rules, and there's only like a finite number of cases, and we can just look up the correct answer for every case. But you can make arbitrarily many combinations of words to form sentences. This means that we need to learn some general functions, but those general functions will fail in some edge cases. In our setting, we think it's important to get these translations right almost every time. But if in 1 or 2% of cases they are wrong, it's not so crucial. The human brain is pretty robust to learning from slightly noisy data. So a common thing that you do in language class at school, for example, is that you talk to other students in the foreign language. And these other students, they will make mistakes. So you're exposed to wrong words sometimes, or wrong grammar, but you're still learning. As long as the number of these mistakes is kind of small enough.
Yes.
And this is what we are aiming for.
You, Valentin Hartmann, why did you decide to work with AI? Was it compulsory given the tool that you wanted to develop, or?
Yes. So we looked into approaches that would be based on more simple heuristics. So, for example, where you have a dictionary and you look up translations of words. But then we did some analyses there, and we found that in English, for example, every word on average has around 2 different meanings. So this would mean that in for half of the cases, for half of the words, it would just be wrong. And this is a too high error rate. So we needed something smarter there. That's one domain where we use AI. Another domain is for creating the learning curriculum. So we need to decide which words to teach in which language, in which order to teach them, creating a mapping of words in the native language to words in the foreign language. And AI is not perfect, so we cannot entirely rely on that. And this is why we are using a mixture of AI and human labor. So right now we are working with a human translator. We could let the human translator create all this curriculum herself, but this would take a lot of time, and we have limited budget right now. So what we're doing is we are creating suggestions from AI tools like ChatGPT. These suggestions are often right, so the translator just has to click, okay, yes, this is correct, which is much faster than creating things from scratch. And for the few cases where the tool is wrong, the human in the loop can correct these mistakes.
You, Valentin Hartmann, what is your daily use of AI technologies when you're not working on it?
Yeah, I like to read research papers in my free time. Maybe it's a bit of a weird hobby, but sometimes there are just papers that I'm interested in and that I don't, that are not so relevant for my work, but that I still like to read. And so I read them, and sometimes I'm not super familiar with the domain of the paper. And then there are sometimes paragraphs that I don't understand because they assume some knowledge that I just don't possess. And what I like to do is copy such paragraphs, put them into ChatGPT, and explain a bit the context of the paper, then ask it, what does this paragraph mean in this context, or what does the author mean with this particular statement? And ChatGPT has tons of knowledge. It has all this background information. And so it can create these explanations for me that would otherwise require me to read through tons of textbooks and accumulate this knowledge myself. So that's a very useful application that I discovered a while ago. In other cases, I use it to get an overview over topics. So when I'm just interested in a particular piece of information, I often want this to be really reliable. So I'd rather do Google search or check Wikipedia or something like that. But when I just want to know kind of what's out there about a topic, then tools like ChatGPT are also very useful.
Mm-hmm. So it's always ChatGPT you're using, or are there other apps that you prefer?
Mostly ChatGPT. So sometimes when it's kind of in this intersection between wanting to have an overview but also wanting to have reliable information, I like to use tools like Google Gemini, for example, that are kind of search first. So they're very much integrated into this Google search and very good for getting links to sources when the search query is a bit more complex and I would have to think myself, okay, how do I put this into a Google search query? And then sometimes it's just easier to formulate this in kind of a natural language question.
Mm-hmm. And so you would say that you use it as a helping tool, not as a knowledge source.
Yeah, like for getting kind of reliable information, I still use mostly search. It's sometimes a bit different when I'm doing coding. So for the startup, I'm doing a lot of programming. There, I would say this is where across work and my free time, I use AI the most. And there is just a very good integration of AI. So the way I code nowadays is that I type text and then I have this plugin that suggests what could come next in the code. And often this is kind of an easy problem. So you very often write the same kind of code many times. And so this just saves me a lot of time. And sometimes there, I just know, okay, this is right, what's suggested there. It's just a bit easier than having to retrieve this myself from my memory.
So you're not losing knowledge when you're doing this. You're not losing some information you should develop by yourself. That's what you're saying.
Exactly.
Just save your time.
Yes. Sometimes I'm also using AI for coding when I kind of don't know what the exact syntax for a certain thing is that I want to do. So kind of which function call I have to make there. And there, if it's not something super critical, so let's say I'm just like exploring data or something, and this is not going to go into the production code, then often I'm also just relying on kind of the AI suggestion, and I try it out, and if it seems to do the right thing, then I go with it. Even though I'm not, like it could be that there's some subtlety that I'm missing, but if it's not a super crucial application, then, and I'm like 90% sure that this is right, then I just go with it.
Mm-hmm. You said also at first that you have studied privacy issues, right?
Yeah.
With data. How do you consider this question of privacy concerning AI?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting one with many facets. So traditionally, before these large language models like ChatGPT came around, the main focus of privacy in AI were concerns about very sensitive data being used for training. So there are, for example, these models that can take as input some X-ray image and then predict whether the patient has a certain condition. And the training data for these kinds of models is, of course, very sensitive because you need kind of X-ray images labeled with a condition, and these X-ray images are images of the bodies of real people. And if you could link those images back to the patients, this would allow you to infer information about their medical conditions. So this is something
Yes, that's an issue, yeah.
Yeah, you really want to prevent. Nowadays, with these large language models, the issues are a bit more subtle. So these very general models like ChatGPT, they are often not trained on these private data sets with very restricted access that are very sensitive, like medical data. But most of that training data is publicly accessible data from the internet. And so one might think, okay, where's the privacy issue here? People could access this data with just a Google search, like large language model doesn't reveal anything that wasn't revealed before. However, what these models can do is they can decontextualize data. So they might see a quote from me, for example, on some forum, take it into their training data, and then when you ask the model something about Valentin Hartmann, the model would spit out this quote or infer something about me from this quote. Mm-hmm. However, it might not take the context in which I said this thing into account. So, for example, I might have said this in an ironic way. So actually, I meant the opposite of that. Another issue might be that there are spaces online that are in principle publicly accessible, but where people assume that they are among themselves. So there's, for example, this chat tool called Discord, which is getting more and more popular. And there are these communities of people with common interests that exchange about those interests. And they often exchange about those interests as if they were in a private space, because usually people don't join these communities if they're not interested in this kind of topic. But what companies do is they still collect this data because there's a way to access it, and it might make its way into the model and suddenly appear in places where people who put it originally online might not have wanted it to appear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's one of the big risks you see with AI use today and privacy, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if tools are being developed to fight this situation?
Yeah, there are tools to protect the privacy of individuals who contribute training data to models. For these traditional models that I described, where the model has one specific task, is trained on a relatively low-dimensional data set. So, for example, to identify diseases from medical data. There we have tools that work kind of well. So there's, for example, something called differential privacy, where the idea is that you add a little bit of random noise during the training in a smart way so that you can ensure that the final model doesn't remember anything about any individual data point that was used during training. This you can mathematically prove. And this works decently well for smaller models. For these very large models like ChatGPT, the amount of noise that you would have to introduce into the model to make this work would kind of destroy all the utility of the model. So you might protect privacy, but then the model would just be useless. And there are a couple of other issues, for example, that you might not even know across how many documents in the training data you find a certain piece of information that you want to protect. And let's say there's some private information about myself that should be protected, but you can find it in like 10 different documents in the training data. Then it's not enough that the model doesn't remember anything about any one data point, but it shouldn't remember anything about any 10 data points. And so with these large models, these issues become much bigger, and I think there's still a lot of research to do.
Mm-hmm. And what do you see in the management and consideration of these AI technology at university first?
Maybe I can first say something about the lab that I've worked in.
Yes.
So my professor was always very interested in natural language. So how do people communicate? What can we learn from discussions online and so on? And he had kind of many questions and things that he would have loved to know, that things that you can learn from text data, but things that were just not possible to investigate with the technologies that were available at the time when he did his PhD. And so now suddenly these large language models came around, and he got the chance to explore all these questions that he was burning to answer for like 10 years. And so now in the lab, we're really embracing large language models as a research tool to extract insights from data. So there it was really a blessing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are other considerations when you are not just using these models as a tool, but you are doing research on the next generation of such models. One problem there is that in order to train such large models, you need large amounts of infrastructure. So you need many servers. These servers need to be powered by a lot of energy. Switzerland is really at the forefront of this, where they've initiated this Swiss AI initiative. They've built a large data center, given access to that to AI researchers who can now do research that's still not at the scale of what companies like OpenAI or Meta are doing, but they're still at a large scale. But Switzerland is a rich country, and universities that might not have access to that much funding from other countries might simply be excluded from this research. And so we kind of have this divide in research accessibility. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In the access also, in the research and in the access. And apart from this, what are your fears or your concerns about the evolution of AI technologies?
A current trend that we've been seeing over the past years is that especially these large language models have been getting larger and larger. And that so far, this has worked pretty well at making them better. So there were some innovations on the architecture of these models and on the way we train them. But most of the progress has come from simply scaling things up. So making these models bigger and bigger, feeding them more and more training data, which works well for making them better at tasks, but which also makes them much more energy hungry. And right now, all of these big companies like Microsoft, Meta, and so on, they're building new data centers. They are looking to secure access to power plants to power these data centers. And they are on track to not reaching their emission goals or their goals for emission reduction they had set out before this advent of large language models. And I'm afraid that if this trend continues, we might be just kind of too excited by these new AI tools because they are continuing to make progress and becoming better, without taking a moment to see, okay, at what environmental cost does this come?
But at the same time, we're using AI to help again to fight climate changes, right? So
there's an interview with Ilya Sutskever and Sam Altman where they are asked about the environmental impact of AI, and where they are saying essentially this. So once we have very smart AI, it will help us create carbon capture technology that will simply solve all of our climate problems. And I'd be thrilled if this would come true, but this is not certain. So it might be that if we continue scaling up these models, at some point they really make a huge dent in helping us fight climate change. But it could be that they still get better, but they only help us make business processes more efficient, or, I don't know, make advertising more efficient, do things that create business value. So companies would still be incentivized to invest into AI, scale up these models, but they would not help as much with climate change, or would not offset kind of the amount of CO2 that they newly introduce into the atmosphere.
Yeah, it will not be the priority.
Yeah.
Do you think there should be a frame of limits that should be set for the industries developing AI technologies? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there are multiple considerations here. So one limit could be in terms of energy use. So to limit the environmental impact of these models.
But would you, but as a researcher yourself, wouldn't it be difficult for you to limit your impact on
actually
while working?
Yeah, actually, these AI models that we use for our tool, for our software, these are very small AI models. So we try to give users a very seamless experience. And the way we've implemented this mechanism of translating words in context now is as a browser extension, which, if you want to see what that looks like, we have a small demo at timely-learning.com. And this kind of hooks into the loading process of websites. So whenever in your browser you open a new website, our tool comes in, it replaces some words with words in the foreign language, and then shows them to you. But this means that the loading process of websites gets delayed. And so we want to reduce this delay as much as possible. And so we are very incentivized to have very small, very fast models. And as a side effect, these models consume much less energy than something like ChatGPT, for example. So in our case, the incentives of building a good product and of using models that consume the least amount of energy are very aligned, and we are actively doing research on making these models even smaller, even more efficient. And to some extent, this is the same for companies like OpenAI. So they are also not interested in spending tons of money on energy bills. But at the moment, they're still in this mode where they simply try to make these models better, kind of no matter the cost.
Yeah. So what else could be the limits, the framework you see that would be absolutely necessary to settle?
There's quite a bit of discussion about risks that arise from AI, not for the environment, but for society. So there are risks that are already present right now. For example, that large language models or image generation models like DALL-E, for example, allow people to very easily create fake news. There have already been campaign posters by political parties using AI-generated images. And right now, especially in the image domain, it's often still relatively easy to spot whether an image is real or AI-generated, but probably a few years from now, this will not be the case anymore. And then we'll just have a very difficult time to tell kind of what's true and what's fake. So right now, for example, image evidence or video evidence is still very convincing to people because up until very recently, this was very hard to fake. But once that's not the case anymore, we might need mechanisms to prove that something is real. So there are some technical solutions. For example, camera manufacturers integrating cryptographic mechanisms that kind of put a signature on images or videos that were created with that camera, so that later on you can kind of prove that this image was created by an actual camera, not by a model. But we might need additional regulation around, for example, forcing social media companies to put in efforts to spot or delete false information something that's already like an issue right now, or that was an issue before AI tools, but that will be an even bigger issue in the future.
And what would you see, Valentin Hartmann, what would you imagine to be the best possible future with these technologies?
I think the best possible future would be if AI would be as useful and hopefully as harmless as it is right now for me in my daily coding. So there I really feel a strong improvement in efficiency. I'm just much faster. I need to look up fewer things. And the amount of harm is relatively limited. So as long as I every time kind of make this judgment call, okay, do I trust this output? Or is this something like very crucial that I should double check online? I think this doesn't, at least in my personal coding, introduce more bugs or mistakes than I would introduce myself when just coding things from scratch. And I think if we could have AI be as useful and as harmless in kind of other domains as well, this would be, just I think a huge improvement for society.
Mm-hmm. But it may not become like that. That's what you mean?
Yes. I think there are domains where this just won't be possible, at least with current technologies. So we like these LLMs, these large language models. Currently, I don't see a good way to ensure that they are 100% correct all the time. So they are trained on these large amounts of data. And this data sometimes just contains false information. That's one issue. And the second issue is that the model might also not correctly represent this data. And in domains where one would want to fully automate the process, so let a large language model make all the decisions, these mistakes that the model sometimes makes might become fatal. So this coding application that I've described, I'm still the one who makes the final call. And I think there are many other domains where there could be a human that makes the final call, but who would still immensely benefit from AI. So in the medical domain, for example, a model could make suggestions for diagnoses based on symptoms, and maybe also suggestions for very rare diseases that a medical doctor might not have thought of themselves. But then there could still be the doctor who kind of takes these suggestions as things to look into more deeply and then make the final call, okay, what medication do I give the patient?
Well, actually, talking about that, there's just a new study that was released showing that doctors, when they are using AI tools, do not give very much better diagnosis than the one who are not using it. But at the conclusion of the study, it reveals that it's because most of them do not know how to use properly the AI. And if they could use it really properly, then the diagnosis would be much better, maybe with the AI. So,
yeah, I think we are using AI in many places in our startup, and often we are creating large amount of data. So it's really useful for us to make the model as good at creating this data as possible, because whenever we kind of manually have to fix a mistake, even if it's just a mistake in 1% of the cases, that's still a lot of cases that you have to go through if the data set that you create is very large. And so we spend a lot of time optimizing the prompts. So what exactly do we tell the model to produce, and in which way do we tell it to the model? And there are some general heuristics that in practice have proven to improve results. But in basically every case, there's still a lot of manual work involved and many iterations to be done to really get this right. And this is, there are some research papers that show kind of automated methods for this, but to a large extent, this is still, an art, basically. And I think people who do not have the time for really optimizing these prompts, people who maybe do not have the linguistic skills to create like 10 different formulations of the same thing to try out, people who are not as good in English because it's not their native language, all of these people will be disadvantaged because they won't get the quality of outputs that they could get. And this last point that I mentioned about English, this is also still a big one. So you can talk to ChatGPT in German, on French, on Spanish. However, it will be worse in those languages. And so people whose native language is not English at the current time will get worse results. And if you come from a place where the spoken language is quite rare, or it's there's not so much data on it online, then the drop in quality will be even larger than for these still relatively high resource languages like German, French, Spanish, and so on.
Okay, that's a big issue here you're pointing out. Do you think that you are part of a minority when you're talking about your point of view on AI in your generation, or would you say that you're sharing this point of view with most of the people your age?
I would say I share this point of view with kind of my immediate circle, so with other people who are very closely working with AI tools, who might even do research on these AI tools and who have really dug deep into them. I think for most people that are not so intimately familiar with these models, they are not as aware of these issues. And for example, they might have never tried to use tools like ChatGPT in English, but only in their native language. And so they don't even know how much better it could be if they would use English. And they're not aware of this disparity. So I would say these are things that people from my lab, friends that are working on similar things, where I mostly agree with them or they agree with me. But I think in the general population, the awareness is just not there yet. And I mean, it's also still a pretty new technology.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we can live in the future without knowing anything about AI?
What I can imagine happen in the future is that these AI tools will be more and more integrated into other tools. So Apple, for example, is integrating AI in many parts of their products now. So for example, they have AI to summarize notifications on the smartphone. They have AI to help you write emails. And the AI in these applications becomes kind of hidden. So
yes, of course, it's everywhere, but without being aware of it being everywhere.
Exactly.
Would that be possible?
This is a possibility. And I think that often people just won't be able to tell, okay, is this just some smart algorithm or is this some AI model? And I think we are not there yet. So right now, a lot of people are using AI through these explicit interfaces. So they explicitly go to a website that can create AI-generated images. They're explicitly going to ChatGPT to ask questions, and there it's very clear that they are interacting with an AI, and maybe they adapt their behavior, or they adapt the way they take the outputs or interpret the outputs to the fact that this is an AI. But if this is not clear anymore, then they might not adapt the way they interact with the AI as much as they do now. So you can also imagine some, customer support. You might communicate with them very differently if you know that's a human versus if you know that's an AI. But already now, if the interface through which you communicate is just a text chat, it can be very hard for a human to tell, is this an actual human on the other side or an AI?
Yes, of course. How do you adapt to an AI when you're having a conversation with an AI? How do you adapt?
The main thing is that I take kind of everything that it produces with a grain of salt, and I never base important decisions on whatever the AI gives me. By now, I'm also quite familiar with the ways in which AI's outputs differ from what I actually want. So I might, even before asking the AI my initial question, already think about, okay, I want to steer the model in the direction in which I want it. So often these models are, for example, very verbose. So I might add a sentence, please only give me this piece of information and no background information. And these are things that I wouldn't do with a human, because if I'm communicating with a human, especially if I know them, they are aware of a lot more context. Like they know in the context of which project I asked them a question, they know what I as a person prefer based on our previous interactions, and so on. And all of these things the model is not aware of. So I need to be a lot more explicit with the model.
Mm-hmm. Who would be your favorite interlocutors if you could choose someone to talk about AI technologies today?
I think I would love to talk to Ilya Sutskever. So he is a researcher who was one of the main minds behind large language models and ChatGPT, and who has now founded his own company. And he was one of the few ones who saw, before much of the rest of the community, that simply scaling these large language models up would make them a lot better and would get us to the quality that ChatGPT has nowadays. And I would be very curious to know what he sees now, what other people don't see, what he predicts for the future.
Mm-hmm. And you have some predictions about this future?
I think this is also something he has said recently, that infinitely scaling these models will hit a ceiling at some point. So we won't be able to simply throw more data and more compute at the problem and keep reaping these benefits that we have so far. And that we will need to come up with new ideas, with new insights, like this insight that training these large language models based on predicting the next word would lead to very general purpose AI systems. Yeah, I think we are back in this phase where human creativity is needed, and I'm pretty excited to see what the research community will come up with.
Well, let's see. Thank you very much.
Thank you.